Hello everyone, welcome to what's potentially the first video on this channel, and it is the first installment of Discography Dissection, the series I thought of where I go through the history and studio albums of an artist or band and give my opinion as I go. Due to this being the first episode, I wanted this to be about a band that I genuinely really love, that being Ween. That being said, let's jump into the 9-album discography that Dean and Jean Ween have gloriously presented to us. In case it wasn't obvious, Jean and Dean Ween are not the actual names of the two founding members of Ween. I know, kinda disappointing. Instead, they have the normal names of Aaron Freeman, known respectively as Jeaner Ween, and Mickey Melchiondo, known respectively as Deaner Ween. Freeman and Melchiondo would meet in junior high school in a typing class where they discover a shared interest in music. These two would go on to, of course, form Ween. For roughly a decade, Jean and Dean would be the only driving musical forces behind Ween, with them being only backed by digital audio tape providing their backing tracks for their live performances, until the release of their 1994 album Chocolate and Cheese, where they would recruit Claude Coleman Jr. as a full-time member on drums. And on a side note, Coleman was actually a member of alternative band Skunk, which Ween opened for one show in New Jersey. Dave Ayers was a man working for Twin Tone Records looking to sign Skunk, and well, Ween ended up actually being signed instead. Skunk broke up in 1991, which actually led Claude back to working with Ween. Wow, this musical universe is just so beautiful. 3 years after Coleman's recruitment, they also get Glenn McClelland on keyboards and Dave Drewitz on bass, with both of them providing additional backing vocals. It's also important to mention the production and bass contributions from Ween Bros' high school friend Andrew Weiss, seeing as how the dude played bass on all of their stuff pre-Drewitz, besides a few tracks where Chris Williams' stage name Mean Ween fills in on bass rolls, and the dude also produced the majority of their studio albums. Before we get into the discography, it's pivotal to mention the lore behind the band, primarily the demon god, the Boognish. The Boognish is a spiky-haired, teeth-glaring dude who is depicted on multiple of their album covers and a plethora of their merch items, as well as mentioned in the lyrics of multiple of their songs. According to Ween Bros, the Boognish is the demon god that compels them to make the music that they make, as well as the very figure it's dedicated to. In the linear notes of their debut studio album, they credit the Boognish with bringing Jean and Dean together, while also claiming that their music is none other than gospel, used as a vessel to spread his word. They also somewhat reference two other instances where the Boognish has reappeared to them, other than of course the communication of Ween's importance. The first instance is to punish Jeaner for attempting to leave the band, and the second, Ween will not discuss, whatever that entails. Another note with Ween lore: in Ween context, the word brown means bad, but in a really good way. Essentially a piece of art designed to not exactly look or sound that conventionally good, but made with only love. So when I use the word brown to describe something in their music, or some aspect of just them in particular, just know that that's what it means. Without further ado, let's dissect the music of Ween! GodWeenSatan is the first in what's known as the Brown Trilogy. This includes this album, obviously, and the two that would come after it, The Pod and Pure Guava. These three albums were given this name because of the very apparent brownness in their writing style and recording techniques, with a lot of the music being written and recorded in their apartment. They named The Pod with a Tascam Track 4 cassette recorder. This album wouldn't be the brownest out of the three albums in my opinion, but it is undeniably brown. I find the brown qualities to actually enhance it quite a bit. Jean and Dean are easily able to show off their odd sense of humor that would become a staple of their sound on tracks like Bumblebee Parts 1 and 2, Common Bitch, Nan, and Puffy Cloud. They would also demonstrate their genre hopping and fusing throughout the many styles they attempt, from the very punky You Fucked Up, the pretty jazzy Never Squeal, and of course the noisy emotional rock masterpiece Birthday Boy. The duo is constantly playing different genres throughout the track list and successfully pulling them off, which makes the over an hour runtime seem really not that bad. To be fair, the album's length is beefed up with the two tracks that pass 8 minutes, Nicole and the Prince-inspired porno song Let Me Lick Your Pussy. Hope that helps you grasp what kind of a band that we're dealing with. However, with LMLYP, it feels as if they don't really justify the length very well in my opinion. The track has undeniably funny moments with Jeaner getting more and more into it the further the song goes, but it doesn't really build up to much despite it being over 8 minutes and 45 seconds. There's still tons of tracks on here that I do feel justify their existence on the album very well, such as the song Don't Laugh, I Love You. I find myself singing along with it pretty often, especially the part at the end. I don't know, man. Just kind of charm to it. I find the ambient and ominous vibe of Blackjack to be pretty stress-inducing, with the low, brooding bass rumbling throughout the entire song in the background. I also really dig the quiet acoustic closer, Puffy Cloud. I just kind of close my eyes, sit there with the song playing, to be honest. I didn't find the album perfect though. There were a small handful of tracks in here that served better as small comedy pieces more than an actual song. With the third song on the track list, I'm in the Mood to Move, I always find myself laughing at it, but it just doesn't really hold up very well on its own. Same thing with Nah, just a little less so. I find myself able to appreciate the musicianship a lot easier, and the ramblings of their character Eddie Dingle it's pretty comical. But I just feel like it lacked substance and something that I could find myself yearning to return to. There's also a small short of tracks that just don't really add much to the album as a whole. Tracks like Licking the Palm for Guava, Hippie Smell, Old Man Thunder, Old Queen Cole, etc. Overall, this album really isn't bad at all. It's actually a pretty solid debut effort from the Ween Bros, and there's a lot stylistically on this album that would be a staple in their stuff in the future. Not to mention how much they'd improve on it a lot with the stuff that they would be experimenting on later releases. I can say I dig, or at the very least respect, most of the stuff on here, so it's earned a 78%. The second installment of the Brown trilogy sees the band go in a bit of a different direction. The strange lyrical themes continue to be strange, with a lot of them even getting stranger. This is credited to Gene and Dean apparently both catching mononucleosis during the recording of the album, with a song named after the infection finding a place on the track listing. Another potential reason for the album's eccentric qualities is the habit of huffing Scotchgard that our beloved Wieners picked up. They'd write this in the liner notes, but would later dismiss it as fans began to huff it as well. The title of the album comes from the name of their apartment, like I mentioned earlier. The entire thing was recorded in there, and the band would allegedly be evicted not too far after the recording of the album. The cover is a parody of Leonard Cohen's 1975 compilation album, The Best of Leonard Cohen, which sees Mean Ween in place of Cohen and wearing a nitrous oxide powered bong. They'd also step up the promotion of the album in comparison to the last one, with music videos being made for the songs Pollo Asado, Captain Fantasy, and Pork Roll, Egg and Cheese. Musically, in my opinion, this is the brownest out of the trilogy. The production has a much more lo-fi sound, the songwriting is seemingly nonsensical at times, and the vocals are heavily distorted, strange effects pretty consistently as well. They change up their sound sonically too, with the past album having a punkier sound, with them taking a much more experimental and quaint approach. And if you ask me, they really improve on a lot of the elements, but unfortunately are sometimes held back with some of the purposeful brownness. The opener is one of the most confusing tracks on the album. It's this song that just never really starts, and it honestly has a very Shags type of aesthetic. It's the same trash can ending type of intro that just kind of loops for 3 minutes, and it oddly works, but probably just because it was Ween that did it. However, I'm not entirely sure this strangeness translates as well on some of the other tracks. Boing is really out there with the pitched down vocals and quiet guitars. It's fine overall, the guitars are honestly pretty nice, but it just kind of feels like an idea that wasn't branched out enough. Molly is easily one of the strangest songs on here. It's got these bouncy industrial sounding synths in the background, with the pitched up vocals doing the strangest performance on the entire record. While it's funny and makes me chuckle every time, musically it's pretty lackluster. Fret not, there are tons of tracks on here that are great. Pollo Asado sees this chill instrumental with a guy ordering Mexican food. It's funny, but it's also really relaxing, and I really like it, I'm not gonna lie. Oh My Dear, I'm Falling in Love is honestly pretty cute. The chipmunk vocals singing about how much they love the person that they're falling in love with is honestly really nice. Vocals are catchy, the drums and guitars are laid back. I honestly dig it. Not to mention the more electronic-oriented songs like Awesome Sound and Demon Sweat, which are catchy in their own rights, with the latter having a pretty epic-sounding build-up and climax by the end. Sketches of Winkle and Can You Taste the Way see some pretty sick guitar riffs. The tracklist also includes the first two parts of the Stallion series, with part 2 being my personal favorite on this album. It's just funny and completely moronic in its own charming way. With all of this being said, we can safely say that Ween is not a victim of the sophomore slump. This was the lowest scoring album out of the trilogy, but it doesn't mean I don't love the album. It's got some low points, but the high points are pretty abundant and strong, and this guy has earned a pretty solid 72%. The band's 1992 album Pure Guava sees the band continue in a similar direction, but with stronger songwriting chops and a different approach to their production. On GodWeenSatan, the album had a pretty amateur sound to the production, and on the pod, it sounded pretty muddy throughout it, with certain parts sounding like they could have been recorded underwater. On Pure Guava, however, they have a much cleaner sound, and they achieve the Brown qualities by putting strange effects on parts or just writing something on the unconventional side. The album was recorded in pretty much the same setting as the previous albums, their apartment. It's also pretty cool to think about the fact that most of these songs that make up the track listing were previously just B-sides originally on the first couple of sets that they released before any actual albums, making this, in a way, the best B-side compilation of all time. This album is probably the least Brown in the Brown trilogy, in my opinion, but that doesn't make it not Brown. There are so many outlandish ideas on here and unique production choices that make up for and honestly cancel out the more polished sound. There's a ton of shifted vocals and genre hopping throughout the track listing that make it very interesting. The opener, Little Birdie, is a pretty catchy and funny rock tune about a dude talking about a bird he's hanging out with. There's also the third installment of the Stallion series, which is easily the most melodic of the series, with it being backed with this dreary instrumental backdrop. A side note for the Stallion series is the third part would be the final one to make it onto a studio recording. Parts 4 and 5 would only exist in live settings and no proper recording aside from live performances being released on All Requests Live. The lead single, Push the Little Daisies, would go on to be one of their most well-known songs. There's also just tons of songs on here that are honestly just dumb fun, like Groovin' Big Jim, industrial sounding tracks like Reggae Junkie Jew, Go and Get Tough from the Get-Go, and the soulful Touch My Tutor. And one of my favorite tracks, I Play It Off Legit, which reminds me a lot of Demon Sweat off of the pod. The best song in the album, in my opinion though, is Don't Get Too Close to My Fantasy. It's an emotional sounding track with a great building and satisfying climax, and they managed to keep the Ween charm throughout. From this track it goes into Poop Ship Destroyer. The song is just complete nonsense basically, but it's really fun. It's also become a live staple for the band, with them only playing it for crowds that they love as a reward or hate as a punishment. Live renditions usually don't really sound too much like the original because it's usually just kind of treated as a long-ass jam session that goes on for up to half an hour. A 26-minute live performance of the song even finds its way onto the track listing for the live album Paint the Town Brown. In general, the low points on this record are generally higher than all the past albums. I wouldn't say I dislike any of the songs on here. Some of them just kind of seem to not add much to the album. Tracks like Loving You Through It All and Sarah just kind of felt half-baked. I guess I just kind of wish they did more with the ideas that were presented in these songs. So to say the Brown trilogy ends on a strong note would honestly be an understatement. Pure Guava is a great album, and it's honestly one of my favorites by the band. It's definitely my favorite in the Brown trilogy. And after much listening, I gave this album a very strong score of 84%. Album number 4, Chocolate and Cheese, really sees Ween come into form. This would be the first album to be recorded in a professional setting as opposed to the apartment and cheap equipment that they were used to. It would also be the first album recorded with more than 2 members due to them getting Claude Coleman Jr. to play live drums on a large amount of the track listing. Despite Coleman's recruitment though, the Ween Bros drum machine would still be very present on a handful of tracks. Chocolate and Cheese would go on to be one of their most influential and well-known albums. Tracks would be covered by bands like Fish, Ash, and singer-songwriter Amos Lee. Musically, it's one of Ween's most diverse releases, with them approaching an even wider variety of styles. Soul, electronic, experimental, fucking circus music. Take Me Away, the opener, sees the band take on a more classic rock sound while falsifying a live setting by creating multiple instances of fake audiences cheering and applauding. The vocalist even gives a chill "thank you" every once in a while. It's a pretty fun way to start an album. It continues with the eerie and odd Spinal Meningitis, which is one of the catchiest choruses on the album in my opinion. The tracklist doesn't take a break though with the beautiful Freedom of 76. This song tells the story of a bunch of famous things that have happened in Philadelphia, and it's done in a very soulful way with Jeaner's falsetto vocals. The 4th song on the album, I can't put my finger on it, is just fun, and the instrumental A Tear for Eddie, dedicated to the late funk psychedelic legend Eddie Hazel, is made of nothing but very emotional filled melodies. Roses Are Free has this very industrial sounding drum beat, but then the song immediately changes the vibe to a much more upbeat sound, which they do incredibly well. Baby Bitch, in my opinion, sounds like a Beatles song if they had a much more vulgar sense of humor. Mr. Would You Please Help My Pony makes me laugh and giggle and smile every time, and I love it. Drifter in the Dark is this dragging, bluesy, mellow track that I honestly never skip. Voodoo Lady is a song that is just impossible not to boogie to. Candy has so much empty space that it just leaves you sitting there waiting in anticipation for the next thing to happen, and it's also very reminiscent of Blackjack off of GodWeenSatan. Buenos Tardes Amigos is an amazing 7-minute ballad performed in a Hispanic style, and it's genuinely beautiful with a crazy twist in the end with the story it tells. The HIV song is the circus sounding song I mentioned earlier, and it's catchier than HIV itself. What Dina was talking about is a song that I just close my eyes and exist in comfort to. If I had to pick a song that is my least favorite, it would probably be Jopper Road. I like the song though, it's just the one that clicked with me the least, which honestly just goes to show how solid the album is. There's definitely an argument for this being Ween's magnum opus. It's loved by the fans and most critics, and it's still being listened to and talked to this day despite it turning 30 this year. Overall, it's a really solid listen, and you're missing out if you haven't checked it out yet. Is it a bit weird? Yeah, but it all works in the album's favor. 94%. That was not a typo, nor did you misread it. These fuckers made a country album. If you haven't gotten used to these constant stylistic 180-degree turns, you should probably get used to it, because doing the unexpected is kind of what to expect from Ween, and believe me, this is not the last surprise you're gonna get from these guys. The recording process for this album was much different than past albums. Gene and Dean don't actually play most of the instruments you hear on the record, besides a couple solos. Most of the musicianship comes from the session musicians they hired, who happen to be made up of some huge country legends. Musicians such as Harris Pig Robbins, Bobby Ogden, Charlie McCoy, and even the Jordanaires, the vocal quartet most known for the backing vocals they provided for Patsy Cline and Elvis Presley. The title of the album is also based on the number of great musicians rather than how many tracks are on the album, because there's only 10. Even with this being their only album where they're limited to one genre, they still managed to stick the landing pretty well. If you ask me, a big thing they did right was the style hopping that they did on this album. Because even though these are all country songs, they're all played in different styles of country. They're constantly jumping from Americana to bluegrass to country rock. They don't really stick to one specific sound. These songs are also riddled with the Ween Bros' personal brown touch for some of the lyrical themes, honesty, even some of the performances. The album opens with a slow ballad, I'm Holding You, which is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, Ween openers. It's beautiful, it's got a nice acoustic solo, I personally love it. Piss Up a Rope is a great breakup tune that has some pretty funny lines. I Don't Want to Leave You on the Farm is a song that is somewhat presented to be a stereotypical country song, but the soft instrumentation combined with the sweet lyrics make it actually really nice. Help Me Scrape the Mucus Off My Brain is also one of my favorites. The catchy vocal melody combined with the tasteful electric guitars in the background make it really relaxing. The closer, Fluffy, is this somber ballad talking about the narrator's dog, Fluffy. He chewed his paw on the porch. Why do you do it on the porch, man? It's honestly a little funny, but it fits seeing as it's Ween talking about dog. The dog are pretty funny. Some of the tracks don't exactly stick out to me though. Pretty Girl is kind of forgettable if I'm being honest, and while Mr. Richard Smoker definitely does stick out with jazzier upbeat style, it didn't really work as well as some of the other songs it did in my opinion. Japanese Cowboy as well. I like the song whenever I'm listening to it, but everything except for the first two lines just kind of leave my mind after the song's done. Yeah, this is honestly a really solid album despite the limitations that they put on themselves stylistically. It's got a diverse range of styles, and while some things didn't exactly stick well for me, I still found most of them working out really well. It's a short album that features some legendary musicians. Why not give it a listen? This one earned an 88% for me. Oh yeah. This one's a big one. The Mollusk is arguably Ween's most well-known album. I think I can safely assume that most people have at least heard the song Ocean Man at this point, which in case you didn't know, is not only by Ween, but is on this album. It had its huge resurgence as a meme a while back, and it was used in the end credits of the 2004 SpongeBob movie. Funny enough, that's not the only connection to SpongeBob that this album has. This album would go on to directly influence the entire show because of its ocean theme throughout. Stephen Hillenburg, the creator of SpongeBob, would actually go on to ask Ween to make a song for the show, which they eventually offered up loop-de-loop. So if you're a big SpongeBob fan, you can actually thank Ween for inspiring the show the most. This record also sees the band go back to their earlier ways of recording, with them all being self-recorded in rented out locations. This is also the first album to see the complete Ween lineup that is still going to this day. Glenn McClelland and Dave Drewitz are now official Ween Bros. Musically, this is one of Ween's strongest and most diverse in style. It starts with the track I'm Dancing in the Show Tonight, which is a reworking of a song from the 1952 TV series Life is Worth Living. And it's honestly one of my favorites with its unique personality and great build-up and climax. Then it goes to the title track, which has this very psychedelic, ethereal type vibe around it. Polka Dot Tail has this very dreary yet catchy sound to it. I'll Be Your Johnny on the Spot sees the band go to a more hard rock sound with some crunchy guitars and bass drums. Mutilated Lips is this really trippy change in pace with strange lyrics and varying vocal approach. The Blarney Stone sees the band's humor at full force in this Scottish sounding sea shanty. It's Gonna Be Alright is another psychedelic sounding song, but with a big Beatles sound to it, which is a band that would go on to directly influence their next album, White Pepper, but that's for 5 minutes from now. The Golden Eel is one of the best songs on the album in my opinion, with its different, very dynamic sections that just continue to build as the song goes on. Cold Blows the Wind continues the amazing song streak with a rework of an old English folk song called The Quiet Grave. The story the song tells is very emotional, and the music that they wrote to accompany it really enhances the words being said. Pink Eye on My Leg is probably the oddest song on the album, with it being primarily made up of their drum machine and noises like a dog barking and a dude groaning. Waving My Dick in the Wind sees the Ween Bros being funny Ween Bros again. It's a fun song, especially the part about old Jimmy Wilson dancing. The kid can really bust it down. The track that follows it, Buckingham Green, is probably my favorite on the album. It has the most satisfying build-up and climax on the record, in my opinion. And there's also a great acoustic solo at the end. I just really love it. Then there's the song Ocean Man, which I probably don't have to describe because you've probably already heard it. The closer, She Wanted to Leave, here's the band performing another sea shanty with a really nice slowed down ending, but that's technically not it, because there's a little instrumental reprise of Dancing in the Show Tonight after about 10 seconds of silence. And with the track listing being laid out, I'll say my least favorite aspects of the album are small complaints to say the least. There genuinely wasn't a song on here I disliked. The weakest in my opinion would probably be She Wanted to Leave, but I still like that song a lot. It just didn't click with me as much as other songs did. So to say I dig this album is an understatement. Chocolate and Cheese is just slightly better in my opinion, but not by much. There's parts of this album that are honestly just as strong, if not stronger, when compared to Chocolate and Cheese. Chocolate and Cheese is just a bit more diverse in style, but this one's more cohesive in my opinion, which is why I give it a 91%. This is a weird one, and it's weird in the very weird sense that it's not weird, which for Ween is weird. This is the aforementioned Beatles-inspired album, and it sees the band just trying to write a solid, catchy pop rock album. And if you ask me, they succeeded. They would even go on to promote the album by performing The Late Show with David Letterman and having music videos made that would actually be directed by the creators of South Park, Trey Parker and Matt Stone, which funny enough wouldn't even be the last time that Ween does stuff with the creators of South Park. This album would also continue Ween's push into being a band with much more acclaim. This album, as well as Chocolate and Cheese, the Mollusk and the Brown trilogy, and their next album, Quebec, would become cult classics and receive much praise from critics and fellow musicians. However, on this album, their core fanbase had a mixed reaction, with some of them appreciating the album for what it is, but the other dismissing it, saying that it was the band selling out. And if you ask me, the band going into a radio-friendly direction for an album is not really a shocker. With this band, you kind of have to learn to accept that your expectations with them will probably be wrong. The music on this album, despite not being as experimental or brown as their early stuff, is still actually really solid in my opinion. They don't limit themselves to one style on the album, they just go for more radio-friendly pop rock songs. There's songs that musically borrow from Latin, country, punk, and even like psychedelic artists. All this goes to cancel out the less out there sound that this album possesses and keeps it just as interesting as each of the albums before and after it. There's one artist though that very clearly influenced a lot of this album and have kind of already spoiled it. It's the Beatles. Musically, there's a lot on here that can easily be traced back to them as an influence. The title and cover is even a reference to the White Album and Sgt. Pepper's. It's pretty clear, like tracks on the lead single, even if you don't, the somewhat gloomy sounding Back to Basem and the acoustic closer, She's Your Baby, that they were listening to a lot of Beatles when they wrote this. The less Beatles sounding songs on here are honestly probably my favorite though. I like the 3 songs I just mentioned. I just personally feel like the other tracks on the album stick out a bit more. The opener, Exactly Where I'm At, is this mid-tempo, groovin' song that is catchy as hell and easy to dance to. The next song, Flutes Chi, has some of the best vocal lines and songwriting on the entire album. Bananas and Blow sees the band take inspiration from some Latin styles of music, and guess what? There's some fucking steel drums on here. Stroker Ace is this very punky, Motorhead-esque song that has some really cool riffing going on in it. Ice Castles is this very sonically psychedelic instrumental, and it's really cool. Robe is this sludgy song in a slower tempo, and I honestly messed with it quite a bit. Stay Forever is probably my favorite on the album though. It's got some really sweet lyrics and a really nice vocal performance. Falling Out is this country pop song about having a falling out with a close friend. It's pretty catchy. Low points on this album don't go that low. Some of the tracks just kind of failed to stick out in the track listing with somewhat blander songwriting. Tracks like Pandy Fackler just kind of go in one ear and out the other for me. I don't dislike them, just compared to everything else by Ween, those songs don't get returned to that often. So on this album, Ween very much proved that they don't need to stick to any one sound in order to write good music. We already kind of knew this though, they just cemented this in our head as a 100% undeniable fact. 85%. Quebec is the band's 8th album, and it's a good one. It actually sees them return to an indie label for its release, with the last album being released on one being The Pod. This is also one of the band's only albums in their later catalog that wouldn't feature Claude Coleman on drums. This is due to him recovering from a car accident during the recording of the album. The majority of the drum duties would be filled in by John Freese of Vandals, Devo, and most recently Foo Fighters fame. Sonically, this sees the band kind of putting their eggs in multiple baskets, as per usual, but in a different way, because the track listing on here has a variety of serious and brown ones. There's plenty of experimentation on here with odd tracks like So Many People in the Neighborhood, which has this strange progression as it goes, but it honestly works. There's also the Fucked Jam, which has a head nod worthy drum and bass groove, as well as the Wall of Electronic Noise, which kind of sounds like an Animal Crossing character talking in my opinion. There's also of course the upbeat and groovy Hey There Fancy Pants. There's a handful of songs on the album that are kind of a mix between serious and brown ideas. This can most likely be credited to Gene Ween going through a divorce during the recording of the album, and it can be seen on tracks like the very lax Zoloft, which has this smooth instrumental with lyrics talking about needing Zoloft to be happy and fulfilled. There's also the track Chocolate Town, which is honestly even more lax than Zoloft. It's sometimes vulgar lyrics and be a little funny, I won't lie, even though they're allegedly about Mean Ween being detained after trying to buy drugs. And there's Happy Colored Marbles, which details everyone being pretty depressed because they're just going through everyday life, but they just keeping on. The low vocals in the verses and high vocals in the choruses are even being used to represent how the protagonist feels when on medication versus when not. In case you couldn't tell, this album is a little depressing, but it's pretty adamant on hiding it on certain songs. There is still a good amount of tracks on here that are pretty depressing and the music actually goes to match. Like on the track I Don't Want It, it's backed by a melancholy sounding instrumental, and the lyrics detail the protagonist being left by their significant other due to their drug abuse. Not to mention my favorite song on the album, If You Could Save Yourself, You'd Save Us All. It closes the album perfectly with its somber songwriting that continues to build as the song grows. The personal lyrics dealing with sadness after the end of a relationship make the song just that much more moving. All this being said, this album isn't 100% perfect in my eyes. The very Simon and Garfunkel sounding Among His Tribe didn't have too much interesting going on for it. I like some of the ideas presented on it. I just wish they did more with it. Same can be said for Captain. The eerie atmosphere that the song builds is really admirable. I just feel like more could have been done with it. And Alkin Road is probably my least favorite on the album because it just didn't really have much going for it personality-wise. With most of my thoughts on the album being laid out, I'll summarize them all with this. I liked it a lot. It's one of their most consistent albums, with the majority of the tracks being around the same quality or better despite their varying sounds and styles. This is a great album that just felt like a fitting way to continue their discography, so that's why I'm giving it an 85. Yup, tied with White Pepper. This is Ween's 9th and most likely final album, and it's also their worst. The track listing is all very incohesive, especially compared to the past efforts by them. With the albums that preceded this one, the songs all felt like they went with each other and generally complemented each other in the context of a full studio album. Even the albums with less of a theme, such as the Brown Trilogy or Chocolate and Cheese. With those albums, the track listings were very diverse stylistically, but they all felt like they melded well with each other and complemented each other. Can't exactly say the same for this album, unfortunately. It seems there may have been an attempted Mexican theme, with the title being in Spanish, the Mexican flag appearing on the cover, and Hispanic music being a point of influence on a good amount of the songs. The opening track, Fiesta, is a very mariachi-sounding instrumental. It's pretty fun and catchy, but it's also pretty redundant, which is honestly a point of contention for most of the songs on this album. A lot of these songs feel like decent ideas that just didn't really get
properly expanded on, which sucks because a lot of the songs on here actually start pretty decent, but they just don't really go anywhere. This is the case with tracks like Blue Balloon, Learnin' to Love, and The Fruit Man. The last song I mentioned is easily one of the worst on the album, and just kind of one of the worst songs by them in general. The experimentation with reggae just falls entirely flat, and to be honest, the entire thing just sounds like a shitty B-side that the band rightfully cut out of the final track listing for Chocolate and Cheese. And let's go back to experimentation. Things that the band experiments with here just don't really work a good amount of the time. The auto-tune on Spirit Walker isn't entirely horrible, but the effect pretty frequently backfires and sounds like complete shit. The Europop track Friends is bad. It's annoying, repetitive, and is honestly wasn't that good of an idea to begin with. I will say the EP version is much more grating, so good on that, I guess. And what is potentially the biggest flop in the album, in my opinion, is Woman and Man. I've seen fans praise this song, but I just don't get it. It's this 10-minute track that does very little to justify its length, in my opinion. It has a pretty cool percussive build-up near the beginning, but what it's building up to just is entirely disappointing. The riff is decent at best, but it could have used some work, and it just is not interesting enough to be repeated as many times as it is. The soloing isn't bad at all, but it just also suffers from the same flaws as the riff of not being entirely interesting enough. The entire song is just kind of boring. I know I've been pretty much entirely negative so far, but I do like a good amount of the album. I do like Fiesta, despite it not being the most interesting thing the band's put out, and I do like some of the melodies and the vibe presented on Blue Balloon. Object is a pretty beautiful song, in my opinion. My Own Bare Hands is a pretty undeniable attitude with lyrics that make me giggle every time I hear them, no matter how childish they are. And Shaymaker is honestly a pretty fun rock and roll song, and the vocals just kind of sound like Tom from Blink-182 with a Brooklyn accent. It's odd. Sweetheart in the Summer is a sweet little tune with some cute melodies. Lullaby gives Object a run for its money with how pretty it is, and the jazzy closer, Your Party, is a really nice soulful finisher. So while yes, I do think this is a pretty easily their worst album, it's still not completely bad. I like a lot of the ideas that they were able to come up with. It just felt like they were struggling to really see them through. There's a lot of good songs in here, but there's also a decent amount of duds. And that being said, this guy got a 62%. Another thing to note is they did release an EP a couple months before this album. I mentioned it when talking about the track Friends because an alternate version of it is on the EP and it has the same name. Just know it's pretty bad, and I don't want to talk about it. After La Cucaracha's release, Ween would go on to seriously struggle as a band. They'd tour for the release of the album, but after that, Gene and Dean would kind of do their own things for a little while. Gene Ween was doing solo shows under the Gene Ween band name, while Dean Ween had been spending his time fishing. He'd get a license to operate a fishing boat and would run a web series titled Brownie Troop Fishing Show. Apparently Trey Parker and Matt Stone, South Park guys, had even been planning for a fishing reality show featuring Dean and Les Claypool from Primus, but as far as I'm aware, that never came into fruition. Pretty disappointing. They get back together for some touring in 2011, which led to the event that's infamous in Ween's history, the Vancouver Meltdown. From the beginning of the performance, it was pretty clear that Gene was not in the right state of mind, whether he had been under substances or had just not been his night. Whatever it was obvious. His vocals were continuously off key and out of tune, and his playing was sloppy and off time. For certain songs, he didn't even do anything, he just laid on the ground while the band played. It all led up to when the band were going to play Birthday Boy off the debut album. While Gene was tuning his guitar, the entire band had effectively abandoned him on stage to play Birthday Boy and the remaining 4 songs alone. He performed Birthday Boy, and from the accounts that I've heard and read, the combination of what had just happened and the song being played made the entire thing extremely surreal. After his performance of the final portion of the setlist, he just walked off stage and the show was over. This event had made it pretty clear to the fans that the band wasn't doing so hot, despite them being able to perform pretty well after the event. In 2011, Diener would release a set of songs titled the Caesar Demos. It essentially consisted of the tracks that made it to Quebec, as well as the other songs that the bands had written at the time of those writing sessions. This unfortunately would cause another rift in the band due to Diener not asking Diener if he could release them or even communicating his plans to do so. He'd even go on to say that the Boognish wept that day in relation to the day that the Caesar demos were released. Gene would eventually go on to Rolling Stones to say that he'd be retiring the Gene Ween name. Not too long after, the band's manager would announce to fans on Facebook that Gene had parted ways with Ween to pursue solo work. This apparently was not communicated to Dean though, with him expressing that it was news to him. He'd also go on to say that as long as the both of them were alive, Ween was still a band. This thing was a life sentence. Gene would eventually continue to confirm his departure of the band and elaborate that he was really struggling with sobriety, which led to his departure from Ween. This all made everything make sense. The Vancouver meltdown, the very apparent tension in the band, it was all pretty clear why. Fans had kind of already put all this together though, so for a lot of Wieners out there, this didn't really come as a shock. In 2015, Gene started to use his Gene Ween stage name again for their performances, which I could imagine sparked quite a bit of hope in the fans. The fans would get what they want in November of 2015 when Ween would announce 2 reunion concerts in February, with the third even being added due to demand. After those shows, the band would continue to play shows and make festival appearances, and as for releases, we'd get some live albums and a compilation album. Dean on Facebook would say that a sequel to Shinolo Volume 1 was in the works, but that was back in 2016, so I'm not exactly sure as to how committed they still are to that. They've also stated after their reformation that they don't exactly have any plans to release another studio album, so don't get your hopes too high, but this is Ween after all, kind of known to shock us, and as of right now, Ween is still kind of struggling. They had to cancel all the shows that they have planned right now, even the Chocolate and Cheese anniversary shows, due to Dean struggling. They've been able to bounce back from things like this in the past though, so we'll see. So that's the music by Ween. If you watched all the way through, thank you very much, sincerely. I genuinely do really appreciate it. This is my first attempt at this whole thing, so if it's rough, please don't give up on me. I'm a learning boy. If you guys dug this, let me know. If you guys hated this, let me know, I guess. I'd love to hear your guys' opinions in the comments on these albums as well, so feel free to discuss with your table partners down there. Anywho, I think that's it for this one. I'll see you next time I upload.